Detroit, Michigan, 1943. The freight doors of the Willow Run assembly plant thunder open, letting in a blast of winter air and a dozen German prisoners of war. Their officers, most of them engineers, men who built Messerschmitts and Panzers for the Reich. Their orders are simple: observe. They step into a noise that feels alive, a heartbeat made of riveters, stamping presses, and conveyor belts stretching clear to the horizon. In front of them, a half-built B-24 Liberator crawls forward on rail tracks, wired open like a mechanical whale. Women barely out of high school tighten its ribs. Foremen in goggles shout over factory thunder. Every 55 minutes, another bomber rolls out the far gate, its tires already warm from friction. The Germans exchange glances, not anger, not hatred, just something heavier. Recognition. One of them mutters that Germany doesn't have enough aluminum to build this many dreams, let alone airplanes. A sergeant behind him just grins. Welcome to Detroit. In that vast, humming hall, the Third Reich's pride met the noise of American industry, and for the first time, its officers understood the war wouldn't be won by courage or cunning, but by capacity. When the war began in 1939, the world underestimated America's machines. Even Washington did. The United States Army fielded fewer than 500 combat-ready tanks, and its Air Corps barely rivaled a single European air fleet. German officers admired American automobiles, but dismissed American industry as soft, too comfortable, too mechanical, too far removed from mud and sacrifice. In Berlin, generals believed mass production built toys, not weapons. The Reich's philosophy valued precision over volume, craftsmen over conveyor belts. German engineers, still heirs of pre-war industrial pride, measured perfection by the steady hands of toolmakers in Augsburg or Stuttgart. Aircraft were assembled like violins, each piece adjusted by eye, each fitting unique. It worked. For a while, between 1939 and 1941, that faith in craftsmanship seemed justified. Panzer divisions rolled through Europe with clockwork reliability. Messerschmitt fighters destroyed opposition built in smaller, slower shops. The word Detroit carried no military weight. It meant Cadillacs and chrome, not carriers and cannons. From the German perspective, America was vast but disorganized, a place that measured profit, not victory. Its machine-made people, as Joseph Goebbels sneered on radio, could never equal the focused intellect of German engineers. Antebellum arrogance disguised itself as confidence, but across the Atlantic, Roosevelt and his advisors were building something different, an economy that could outbuild ideology itself. In the 1930s, American corporations had already mastered efficiency for a nation drifting from depression toward productivity. The Ford Motor Company's assembly line had transformed how people thought of work. Labor divided into actions, each motion timed, every mistake observed. By 1938, Ford could produce 15 cars every hour. General Motors, Chrysler, and Packard had converted skill into rhythm. And, though few could see it, rhythm into potential power. When France fell in 1940, that potential became necessity. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt told Congress bluntly that America must become the great arsenal of democracy. Factories that once stamped metal for sedans now press steel for Sherman tanks. The same mills that rolled refrigerator sheet now shaped fuselages for bombers. The numbers disturbed even Washington accountants. $80 billion in defense orders, 50,000 plants redirected, 19 million new workers mobilized. No other democracy had ever turned its consumer abundance into war capacity so completely or so fast. The Germans saw the announcement through intelligence intercepts and laughed. They had reasons. The Reich's four-year plan under Hermann Göring had already militarized the German economy. No one believed a capitalist republic, debating in Congress, regulated by unions, dedicated to overtime pay, could match the brutal efficiency of National Socialism. But there was a detail they missed. In Germany, obedience powered production. In America, competition did. And competition never sleeps. WWII 1941, before Pearl Harbor even burned. U.S. factory belts were already feeding Britain's defense through the Lend-Lease program. Trucks, aircraft engines, ammunition. Freighters from New York and Baltimore carried more material each month than Britain's own arms firms produced in a year. And yet Roosevelt's promise seemed impossible to citizens at home too. The images of war were still oceans away. Nobody had seen Luftwaffe raids or tank columns firsthand. American cynics called it the arsenal illusion. Even Henry Ford scoffed when the military asked him to make airplanes. He told them cars and bombers were different worlds. Then came Pearl Harbor, and the illusion turned into mobilization. Factories that had gone dark during Depression-era layoffs exploded back to life overnight. Automobile plants became aircraft plants. Railway yards grew hangars. Ford engineers sketched blueprints for a facility that could build the consolidated B-24, America's heavy bomber, by continuous line. The result would be Willow Run, a haul 1.5 miles long where aircraft would crawl nose to tail like automobiles through progressive birth. To German eyes, that sounded absurd. Aircraft were supposed to be assembled slowly and tested by craftsmen. But absurd was about to take flight every 55 minutes. This was not just mechanical evolution. It was cultural rebellion. America trusted systems, not single geniuses. The German Reich trusted genius until death. In 1941, that difference was invisible. By 1943, it would become the margin between mastery and collapsed at this point. In Europe's war rooms, few German officers understood what mass production meant when applied to despair. They would soon learn, at the cost of every advantage they thought permanent. In 1942, the transformation of American life reached a scale unseen in human history. The United States was no longer preparing for war, it was manufacturing it. Every skyline from Los Angeles to Buffalo turned into scaffolding. Steel plants poured metal day and night. Welders joked that the moon over Ohio glowed orange from furnaces alone. 1 out of every 3 jobs in America now belonged to defense. Factories worked like orchestras. The conductor's baton was not a uniformed general, but a stopwatch. Henry Ford, stubborn, aging, still unconvinced by foreign wars, eventually watched his company carried by younger minds. His engineers and executives proved what once seemed impossible, a bomber moving down an assembly line like a sedan. At Willow Run, 42,000 workers built the B-24 Liberator in a single continuous flow. By 1944, the factory produced one entire bomber every 55 minutes. No nation, not even Germany at its peak, had matched such rhythm. The statistics read like fable. Automakers produced 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 3 million military trucks, and 2 million rifles. Numbers too huge for imagination. But quantity told only part of the story. Each machine worked because a continent's supply chain was learning to hum in synchronization. Auto plants in Michigan shipped gearboxes to shipyards in San Francisco. A farm in Iowa grew the soy oil that greased gunplates in Tunisia. American democracy, once mocked for its inefficiency, became the most efficient collective engine the world had ever seen. To German observers, this was unthinkable. Their own economy was tied in hierarchy. Albert Speer, appointed armaments minister after Fritz Tote's death in 1942, pushed Germany toward industrial consolidation, but it was too late. Factories across the Reich still worked under rival bureaucracies: Army, Air Force, Navy, SS, Party, each hoarding contracts, withholding raw materials. And as Allied bombing deepened, output scattered. One destroyed railway might silence a whole line of tanks. By contrast, American production absorbed chaos as function. Destroy one plant, and 5 others filled the order within days. America also harnessed a workforce composition no totalitarian system dared attempt. When young men marched off to Europe and the Pacific, women filled tool stations. By 1943, over 6 million women welded, riveted, and lathed in fields once closed to them. Factory posters called them Rosie the Riveter, but inside smokestacks they were simply laborers, dirty, proud, fast. At Ford, a third of employees were women. At Boeing and Douglas, nearly half. Immigrants and Black Americans joined them in huge numbers, crossing color lines through shared necessity. Integration in wartime industry outpaced laws by a generation. Every shift in production philosophy carried military consequence. The number of aircraft mattered less than the speed of replacement. When German officers compared figures, the ratios stunned them. For every Messerschmitt Bf 109 the Luftwaffe produced, American factories produced 6 P-51s or Hellcats. For every Panther tank finished, U.S. lines delivered 10 Shermans. War became arithmetic. Patton later said, "The enemy fights with equipment. Americans fight with replacements." That sentence summarized the industrial war. The logistics behind it were mind-bending. New rail lines connected Detroit to Gulf Coast ports in record months. Liberty ships, mass-produced steel freighters, sailed from eastern shipyards faster than U-boats could sink them. One famous launch at the Kaiser shipyards saw a full 10,000-ton vessel, the Robert E. Peary, constructed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes. That speed shattered logic and terrified enemy analysts. For the Wehrmacht, resupply meant weeks by rail. For the Americans, it was hours by conveyor and pipeline. When German officers captured in North Africa or Sicily arrived in U.S. camps, they began seeing hints of this power. They noticed trains arriving with meat, mail, and magazines. Everywhere abundance. The same soldiers who had believed themselves heirs of the mechanical age now realized they had misjudged its inventor. They wrote home in disbelief that even prisoners were fed with metal tins and powdered coffee from factories still running triple shifts. Back in Germany, Albert Speer warned Hitler repeatedly that industrial mathematics decided destiny. Hitler waved him off, insisting genius always beats numbers. But genius does not fly faster than 1,000 new bombers. And the slow, predictable German craft model was dissolving under an avalanche of American pragmatism. That moment, when production became strategy, turned the war from battlefield to factory floor. Every rivet set in Detroit echoed like an artillery shell across Europe. And before long, the enemy would come face to face with the noise they once mocked. For those who worked the factory floors, the war was measured not in battles, but in shifts. There were no parades, no frontline glory, just heat, smell, and sound. At the Ford River Rouge complex, women riveters worked 12-hour days without seeing daylight, sealed inside metal walls of noise. The air filled with the hiss of compressed oxygen and the thunder of presses hammering aluminum sheets thin enough to flex between fingers. Lunch breaks happened beside the same machines that drowned out conversation. A poster above every assembly line reminded them, "The limit is none." These men and women were not soldiers, yet their rhythm kept soldiers alive. A private clinging to a rainy hill in Italy didn't know their names, but the rifle in his hands, the jeep beneath him, and the plane above him all whispered proof of their work. In rust-colored welds and stenciled serial numbers lay the fingerprints of ordinary Americans transforming skill into power. War had always been fought by courage. Now it was fought by shifts and pay slips. The assembly line was not new, yet in the crucible of global conflict it became a weapon mightier than artillery. Charles "Cast Iron Charlie" Sorensen, Ford's production genius, redesigned aircraft manufacture by translating automotive logic into aviation precision. Blueprints were simplified, jigs standardized, and subassemblies numbered like grocery stock. Unskilled workers could repeat expert tasks perfectly because the tools directed their motion. At Willow Run, parts for the B-24 Liberator traveled more than a mile from first rivet to flight test runway. Each worker installed a single piece, yet through them, an entire bomber seemed to waltz across concrete like a living diagram. The Germans refused to believe aircraft could be built this way. Speer later wrote that his engineers laughed when reports claimed Ford was mass-producing planes. To them, a flying vehicle required artisanship, not repetition. They misunderstood that repetition was now the art. In America, standardization didn't kill individuality, it empowered it. Every bolt became a soldier in an army of parts, all identical, all replaceable, all reliable. Out of captured American wrecks, German analysts discovered stamps reading "Willow Run Plant." Those tiny letters haunted them. They realized the enemy they faced did not possess merely machines, it possessed infinity. While generals mapped battlefields, businessmen mapped assembly flows. Roosevelt's genius was choosing men who understood both. William Knudsen, once president of General Motors, left a salary of hundreds of thousands to serve for $1 a year as director of production. He and industrialist Donald Nelson coordinated factories the way Eisenhower later coordinated armies, by logistics. The War Production Board became its own front. Their daily briefings read like battle reports, output in tanks rather than terrain gained. FDR replaced speeches with statistics, publicly announcing new quotas through his radio addresses to keep morale and momentum tied. He knew numbers could inspire, as well as slogans. Knudson's team adapted management lessons from every sector. A single account shows master schedules pinned beside frontline maps, so commanders understood how many guns would follow each offensive. War planning fused with corporate discipline until America's generals spoke factory language fluently. For the first time in military history, inventory was strategy. Germany's command pyramid, by contrast, bottled decisions at the top. Hitler personally approved minute production choices that slowed progress by weeks. Authoritarian control choked technology. Democratic delegation unlocked it. The irony was brutal. Freedom produced precision. Dictatorship produced delay. WWII 1943. Captured documents and intercepted radio traffic painted an unmistakable picture for German intelligence officers. At first, they dismissed it as American boasting. Claims of a ship launched every few days, of submission to women's labor, of car companies making tanks. But evidence accumulated. Spy photos from the Luftwaffe's transatlantic reconnaissance confirmed gigantic coastal plants, each spanning more land than a Bavarian city. Convoys multiplied. U-boat sinkings could not stem their tide. Albert Speer, reviewing production tables, calculated that even if Allied bombing halved U.S. output, it would still exceed Axis totals by 3-1. His memo to Hitler called the situation mathematically hopeless. The Führer ignored it at the same time. The morale of ordinary German soldiers began to bend under mismatched odds. Letters recovered from North Africa by intelligence analysts contained muted awe. One corporal described seeing 3 enemy trucks for every 1 man, and airplanes circling as if grown from the sky. These were not taunts. They were confessions. They had witnessed industrial warfare operating beyond comprehension. For them, every American engine rumbling over the horizon sounded less like machinery and more like inevitability. The battle of production had crossed from ideology into arithmetic. And for anyone observing from the German side, the formulas were terrifying. It wasn't that America built better tanks. It simply built enough to make perfection irrelevant. If Germany's weapon was order, America's was diversity. Factories packed with accents, dialects, and skin colors produced harmony from chaos. Polish newcomers welded beside Southern sharecroppers. Navajo men trained as machinists. Women from coal towns learned turret assembly in weeks. Instead of thinning discipline, this variety strengthened it. The U.S. government framed production as democracy's answer to tyranny, many working as one, without coercion. Propaganda posters weren't threats. They were invitations. Do the job he left behind. Freedom's war needs you. The tone implied trust rather than command. And trust can run faster than fear. To foreign observers, this morale looked dangerously naive. Germans equated voluntary labor with weakness, expecting strikes and shortages. But Union leaders like Philip Murray and Walter Reuther ordered cooperation rather than confrontation, tying working hours directly to patriotism. When Nazi broadcasts mocked soft American bourgeois, shipyard cranes in Oregon were launching destroyers every 11 days. The contradiction was profound. A free society, which tolerated argument, disagreement, and laughter, was outperforming an empire conditioned for silence. The mass of machinery meant little without motion. And nowhere did American genius display itself more visibly than in logistics. The Red Ball Express, 16,000 U.S. Army trucks roaring across Europe from the beaches of Normandy, became the pulse of Allied advance. Those convoys were the visible manifestation of Detroit's rhythm transplanted to the battlefield. Each truck carried spare parts identical across models because Detroit had standardized them years earlier. When tires burst, replacements fit immediately. When carburetors failed, new ones slotted perfectly. Weapons were no longer handmade puzzles but interchangeable sentences of war. German supply units, shackled by shortages and design overkill, drove masterpieces that broke under dust. The vaunted Panther tank's high-precision transmission required maintenance only a handful of factories could perform. If damaged in Russia, it stayed damaged. By contrast, Sherman crews repaired engines with spare Jeep parts and a wrench. Quantity had translated into practicality. Where the Wehrmacht stalled for lack of fuel, Patton's Third Army drank from endless black rivers pumped from America's refineries. The wartime joke summed it neatly. Patton's tanks run on Detroit. 4 German prisoners transported to the United States. The Allied edge ceased to be theoretical. At camps across the Midwest, Wehrmacht engineers and mechanics were driven past industrial skylines stretching beyond vision. Ford, General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, Boeing. Some were invited, under the Geneva Convention, to inspect captured tanks or aircraft for identification. Others simply worked farm details near rail lines carrying endless freight. Every day they watched trainloads of machinery move west as fresh ones rolled east. Letters later intercepted by censors described disbelief and dread. "You cannot destroy a land that builds like this," one wrote in 1944 from Iowa. Another confessed, "Every yard here is a workshop. We will drown under metal." The Allies never produced these tours for propaganda value. They were practical necessity. But in doing so, they revealed a truth the Wehrmacht had only theorized. The United States functioned as a single, continent-sized assembly line. It fabricated not just weapons, but confidence. Every German visitor recognized it instantly. In industrial terms, the war was over even before armies knew it. Asterisk behind the machine army stood planners who thought decades ahead. Donald Nelson's War Production Board and Henry Kaiser's shipyards functioned like organisms, feeding each other resources in continuous cycles. Kaiser pioneered prefabrication. Entire ship sections welded separately, then slid together as if assembling toys. Each innovation birthed another. Nelson's planners computerized supply through primitive tabulators, precursors to data networks, ensuring no part went missing between factory and front. The result wasn't just volume. It was prediction. The U.S. military could forecast shortages months ahead and redirect steel or copper before crises occurred. That foresight repeatedly stunned German analysts, who assumed democracies reacted slowly. Instead, they had met a republic that could think in gears. Even Hitler's enemies among his generals admitted it grudgingly after the war. Field Marshal Hans Jeschneck described American logistics as under devil's order, a phrase half curse, half admiration. He had watched Luftwaffe squadrons bled dry from fuel gaps, while Allied bombers replaced losses as fast as they fell. For him, the decisive weapon of democracy was not the atom, bomb, or the tank. It was scheduling. Each of these angles converged toward the same realization felt later by every Wehrmacht prisoner staring at a rail convoy of jeeps and airplanes beyond counting. The United States had not simply mobilized industry. It had weaponized consistency. The next section marks the moment that understanding transformed from suspicion to certainty, when German soldiers saw the assembly lines for themselves, and the abstract thunder of industry became undeniable sight. Spring 1943. A cold morning sun sweeps across the tarmac of the Ford Willow Run plant outside Detroit. The smell of machine oil drifts past watchtowers topped not by guards but floodlights, their beams still fading from the night shift. Buses arrive carrying a handful of German prisoners transferred from Fort Custer for labor assessment. Engineers, toolmakers, aircraft mechanics. U.S. officers figured, if they could identify stress points in captured Messerschmitt wreckage, they could also sweep factory floors. The irony remained unspoken. These men had helped build the Luftwaffe. Now they would sweep under the machines that outproduced it. When doors opened, the noise struck them like physical wind. A workshop a mile long roared in continuous rhythm. Riveters, conveyor chains, turbines, whistles. Heat rose through grated floors. Rows of women in overalls guided aluminum frames down the line under signs reading, "Keep EM flying." Every 15 yards, a new section of fuselage bloomed with panels until by the end, wings and nose closed to form a bomber. One of the Germans froze. His eyes followed a rivet gun passing hand to hand like a choreography step. He murmured something to his interpreter. It is coordination, not labor. The phrase would later appear nearly word for word in a German intelligence memo. The prisoners watched a supervisor, barely 26, consult charts composed not by engineers, but by mathematicians. Colored pins tracked production goals hourly, not daily. Clock hands moved with factory tempo like a metronome. No speeches, no threats, only momentum. The visitors asked how many aircraft the plant produced each day. The escorting sergeant smiled, about one an hour. The Germans laughed, assuming mistranslation. Minutes later, a siren signaled another completed B-24 rolling toward the snow-bright runway. Laughter stopped. Inside a break room, posters listed company picnic dates beside casualty tallies from the front. A blend of ordinary life and total war almost incomprehensible to men raised under dictatorship. They saw teenage girls chewing gum between rivet cycles, foremen smoking, a union notice about overtime pay pinned beside a Red Cross certificate. Somehow, discipline survived freedom. That defied every lecture they'd heard since 1933. Back in Germany, Albert Speer was compiling a secret report for Hitler while British and American bombs pounded Essen and Hamburg. He delivered his findings bluntly. Germany could no longer match Allied production even if every slave and child worked. One statistic chilled him most: Ford's claim of 8,000 B-24s per year from one facility. Speer ordered his own aircraft factories to adopt mass methods but lacked space, skilled labor, and fuel. He later wrote that even our fantasies could not keep pace with their realities. In August 1943, U.S. Army intelligence circulated captured German correspondence describing American industrial practice. A frustrated officer wrote, "They have achieved full mobilization of coffee drinkers and secretaries." He wasn't entirely wrong. Behind frontline glamour stood typists processing logistics faster than any general staff. Typewriters, filing cabinets, and IBM punch card machines became arsenals of organization. The Wehrmacht fought with precision optics. The Americans fought with paperwork that predicted need before soldiers voiced it. Among the POWs moved from Detroit back to the camps, the story spread like confession. Letters reviewed by censors carried disbelief. "I have seen factories that move," wrote one Luftwaffe mechanic. "They never sleep. Even the night works." For men who believed Germany the incomparable workshop of the world, this revelation was existential. Production here seemed detached from effort, driven by systems, not sweat. They began to suspect that the Allies didn't merely win with numbers. They had erased the difference between man and mechanism on the military front. That translation of industry into momentum became visible months later. At Kursk, Allied-built American tractors hauled Soviet tanks to the largest armored clash in history. In Sicily and Salerno, convoys staffed by the same Detroit engines delivered Patton's division's coastal immortality. Every Sherman's rumble, every Jeep bouncing across Italian gravel, carried echo lines born in American foundries, soundtracks of logistics now turned symphonic. The Germans who visited Willow Run and their superiors who read Speer's reports shared bleeding realization. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting a machine culture. A world that measured patriotism in output per hour and believed boredom was just another form of courage. The revelation reached morale tense like sermon. For every bomber we destroy, they build four. By autumn, even Hitler's inner circle whispered the grim arithmetic. Steel for Germany ran by the kilogram. For America by the mountain. Those who had once mocked the democracy of assembly lines now prayed their bombs might at least disrupt it. But bombing rhythm is harder than bombing buildings. And America's rhythm sounded eternal. BY 1944. That revelation moved from factory floors to battlefields. Everywhere German troops turned, they met evidence that the American machine never paused. At Normandy, soldiers of the Wehrmacht stared across piles of captured Allied gear. Jeeps still warm, crates of ammunition stacked as if a warehouse had spilled onto the beach. Supply ships waited at anchor, unloaded and reloaded in rhythm. Cranes danced around the clock. German officers wrote in field diaries that the Americans seemed to replace losses before they occur. That sentence defined the new war, the future ordering itself before the present finished dying, from occupied France to the Rhineland. Prisoners captured in late 1944 were stunned not just by what they saw, but by what they heard. Convoys hummed like cities on wheels. Endless relays of trucks carried food, helmets, spare parts, each crate stamped, "Made in USA." From field bakeries to mobile cinemas, affluence marched with the infantry. For men raised on ration bread and salvaged tires, the sheer weight of supply lines delivered its own psychological bombing. The American army lived better at the front than many Germans did at home. That fact provoked disbelief more profound than any defeat. At ordnance depots behind the lines, captured scientists were occasionally escorted through hangars to catalog material. Dr. Kurt Diebner, a physicist conscripted into munitions analysis, later described standing before endless racks of aircraft engines stacked three high, each polished, tagged, and ready. They could afford waste, he admitted. We could not afford perfection. Such candor never reached German newspapers, but in prisoner debriefings it surfaced repeatedly. The Americans were industrialists of time. They built faster than destruction traveled, in the Pacific. The same theater repeated the lesson on a grander stage. Japanese reconnaissance pilots photographing Peleliu and Leyte recorded shorelines glittering with metal, bulldozers, floating cranes, prefabricated piers, tools of a military that fought nature as confidently as nations. Japanese intelligence calculated that American shipyards were launching one warship roughly every 17 hours. Even the emperor's briefings conceded grimly that industry itself had turned against Japan. Where German planners looked at enemy numbers, Japanese officers described emotion. The Americans do not fear corrosion. They fight with rust still on the metal. Machines reached the front. Before their paint dried, Albert Speer's last attempt to reverse this avalanche came in the Total War Conference of early 1945. He promised Hitler miracles of jet, fighters and rockets. But for each new Me-262 fighter ready to fly, 5 P-51s already leapt from Allied airfields. Every wounded Tiger tank that limped off the line was met by a platoon of Shermans waiting for fuel. At that ratio, strategy became mathematics. A formula of exhaustion. One Germany could no longer solve. Inside Germany, the consequences were visible beyond collapsed buildings. Children dug flak trenches beside burned-out workshops too small to matter, while Allied bombers returned nightly. Yet intelligence files kept reporting new Allied production records. The Luftwaffe's intercept service even confirmed factory output by counting serial numbers on downed aircraft. They ran sequentially, proving uninterrupted manufacture. It was data-driven despair. Speer later confessed that he realized the Third Reich was outnumbered by calendars. Through those winter months, American confidence hardened. When GIs advanced toward the Rhine, they found trains of German tanks abandoned for lack of fuel while their own divisions carried reserves and jerrycans stamped with company logos from Pennsylvania and Texas. The United States blurred the line between military and civilian. Every gas pump, bakery, and rail switchman back home remained part of the front. What German generals had dismissed as disorganization now revealed itself as distributed strength, the chaos of freedom functioning as ordered by spring. Allied supplies outpaced geography. At Remagen Bridge, artillery arrived faster than coordinates could be logged. The front was no longer held together by trenches, but by logistics itself, lines of movement fueled by the factories the Germans had once scorned. Captured Wehrmacht Colonel Wilhelm Ritter wrote in April 1945, "They have learned from Henry Ford what we refused to learn from Speer. The assembly line is their general." The final months of fighting confirmed his words. When Germany surrendered that May, millions of its soldiers laid down weapons already obsolete against an enemy that knew how to multiply faster than it could think. Across the Atlantic, the same workers who built bombers now turned wrenches to assemble peace. Cars again instead of tanks. Refrigerators instead of gun carriages, proving the power could pivot as easily as it forged. The German officers who once laughed inside their first American factory visits carried home an understanding they never forgot. Industrial democracy had done what authoritarian command could not. It had built continuity out of chaos, victory out of volume, and proved conclusively that numbers and freedom, when combined, could be invincible. The guns fell silent in May 1945, but the hum of American industry never stopped. In Germany's ruins, captured officers began realizing what the Willow Run demonstration had really meant. They saw it reflected now not in promise, but in aftermath. Entire rail yards overflowed with Allied vehicles waiting for redeployment. Sherman stacked 2 stories high on flat cars, endless truck convoys filling the Rhine's bridges. The industrial flood that had drowned Europe's armies still rolled onward, too large to halt even at victory. For 6 years, America had learned to define patriotism by production, and stopping that rhythm suddenly seemed unnatural. For the Germans who survived captivity, the transition was tormenting. Many came from cities burned to cinders. Their workshops and engines lay beneath twisted steel and glass. In U.S. prison camps across the Midwest, those same men worked harvests, assembled farm tools, drove tractors, and discovered that the same ideas that had beaten their war could rebuild their peace. American guards often included them in community meals, showed them newspapers boasting full employment, and stores packed with goods. It wasn't cruelty. It was demonstration. A nation that could defeat them so completely could also afford generosity. Albert Speer himself, interrogated at Kronberg Castle, admitted how deeply that contrast haunted him. While the Third Reich devoured its human capital through conscription and camps, his enemy had mass-produced freedom. He told his allied interrogators, quietly, "We built weapons. They built systems." The phrase became his epitaph long before his death. Back home, American newspapers cautioned against triumphalism, yet pride was impossible to suppress. The War Production Board published final figures that read like a new alphabet of power: 296,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million trucks, 124,000 ships, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. More astounding, by 1944 those peaks had been achieved while consumer goods quietly re-entered stores. Civilian automobiles were still scarce, but radios, typewriters, even children's toys trickled back. No empire in history had waged total war without starving its citizens. America had managed both indulgence and invasion. That duality, the ability to fight ferociously abroad while remaining familiar at home, was to the defeated a miracle disguised as logistics. Post-war Germany soon experienced it firsthand. Under occupation, American supply columns didn't vanish. They merely shifted cargo. Trucks that had carried shells now delivered bread. C-47s, once dropping paratroopers, now scattered sacks of flour under Operation Vittles. German civilians stared upward at aircraft bearing the same white stars they had cursed a year before, this time releasing food rather than bombs. Even skeptics within the Wehrmacht admitted respect. If American abundance could heal as readily as it could harm, then perhaps industrial strength contained a strange morality of its own. Meanwhile, in Washington, the wartime manufacturers refused to fade quietly. Henry Kaiser turned shipyards into healthcare programs for employees, a model that would evolve into the Kaiser Permanente system. Ford, GM, and Chrysler retooled again, birthing sleek automobiles whose tail fins carried the silhouette of jet aircraft. The arsenal of democracy became the marketplace of the world. As Europe struggled to rebuild, American exports filled its gaps: tractors, food, steel. Everything Germany once imagined it had mastered. For German engineers allowed to study abroad in 1946 and 47, the lessons were humbling. Visiting the same Midwestern plants they had once dismissed, they found them reorganized yet efficient, worker councils debating improvements, unions negotiating hours rather than obedience. Out of humiliation came education. The new factories built under U.S. occupation policy in places like Ruhr and Stuttgart adopted American conveyor designs and Ford-style scheduling. Slowly, the ghosts of Willow Run seeded a new industrial Germany, not militarized but democratic, technically fluent, globally integrated. It was a paradox beyond any ideology. The victors teaching the defeated how to manufacture peace, and across the ocean, Americans looked on with a mixture of pride and disbelief that the nation once branded isolationist had reorganized half the planet through production alone. Steel, oil, and assembly had achieved what speeches couldn't. A new order built not on conquest, but on competence. The meaning of victory now had to be measured not by bombardment, but by blueprint. By 1947, the industrial contest that had ended the war was already laying the groundwork for the next world, the Cold War. But its roots remained the same factory floors the Germans had once walked in disbelief. American planners understood that production itself was security. They had seen what fear could do to a continent. Now they would try to rebuild one with surplus instead of shortages. The Marshall Plan functioned less as charity and more as industrial evangelism. Between 1948 and 1952, American cargo ships unloaded $13 billion worth of equipment, wheat, locomotives, and entire assembly lines into Western Europe. German workers dismantling bombed facilities suddenly found brand new conveyor sections stamped Detroit Steel Works. Within months, those machines were running again, this time under blueprints insisting on efficiency through cooperation, not coercion. The irony escaped few. Germany, once determined to dominate through production, was rising under American tutelage using the very methods that had defeated it. Former Luftwaffe engineers examining the wartime miracle now translated it into peacetime pragmatism. They discovered that U.S. factories had succeeded not simply by expansion, but by precision management. Every part, every shipment, traced through punch card accounting. What they learned would later blossom into Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, a recovery driven by the same principles of standardization and decentralized responsibility that America had perfected under fire across the Allied world. Visiting journalists described in near-religious tones the scale of production they witnessed in 1945. At the New York Times office, one reporter wrote, "It was our factories, not our fortresses, that ended Hitler." The sentiment rang true from Chicago's smelters to California's shipyards. The United States had discovered the purest conversion of democracy into material form, a government that counted votes and engines with equal precision. Meanwhile, the veterans of Willow Run and River Rouge returned to ordinary life. Many never again touched machinery that monumental, but their practices endured. Assembly flowcharts carried into universities, management systems exported to Japan, data analysis evolving into computing science. The IBM punch card, once used to track bomber parts, now organized savings accounts and census records. Peace became administrative, just as war had been industrial. For Germany, understanding came with humility. Captured officers who had once scoffed at mass mechanization now briefed the new Bundeswehr on logistics discipline, insisting supply outranked strategy. Speer, imprisoned at Spandau, wrote in his memoirs that America's superiority was never mystical. It was organizational. He devoted chapters to the Willow Run output tables and the paradox of abundance built through freedom. His admission carried weight in a world now splitting between two superpowers, each measuring strength in factories. Even the Soviet Union, America's uneasy ally, studied U.S. production relentlessly. Captured machinery from Lend-Lease aid filled Moscow's institutes. Soviet planners credited Ford's system for teaching them modern mass fabrication. In one of history's quiet ironies, the descendants of Detroit's engineers would later design cars for both democratic allies and communist competitors. The template repeated endlessly: scale beats scarcity. The American principle had become universal. LAWWII the early 1950s. Visitors walking through those once secret plants found the same echoing halls where bombers had been born, now producing lawn mowers and refrigerators. But etched into concrete floors were still faint markings of assembly lanes, ghost lines of a civilization that realized its own power the moment an enemy acknowledged it, whether a passing tourist recognized it or not. Those corridors embodied the memory of a war decided not merely by courage but by calculation, and the prisoners who had stood awestruck in 1943 could never forget that sight. Many returned decades later as businessmen and partners during West Germany's industrial rebirth. Some even toured new joint venture factories with American managers, shaking hands under banners declaring "Made Together." What began with humiliation evolved into collaboration, the final act of reconciliation forged in mechanics, not treaties. History would remember the battles, but veterans of the assembly lines understood something deeper. The war's real front was measured in man-hours, and the soldiers who never carried rifles had won it with wrenches, pencils, and schedules. Their victory continued roaring quietly in every peacetime engine that turned afterward. Out of noise came order. Out of order came endurance. And from a single factory floor in Michigan, the modern world spun forward, its gears greased by the revelation that mass production, guided by freedom, could conquer empires faster than any army could march. Victory in 1945 wasn't forged solely in the mud of Normandy or the ash of Berlin. It was minted in the rhythmic clang of presses, and the hiss of welders who never left American soil. Industrial power had become moral power, expressed not through conquest, but through capacity. For the first time in history, a nation proved that democracy and efficiency could coexist, that free people could organize themselves with the precision of a machine without surrendering their humanity. When captured German officers walked those assembly lines in Michigan, they weren't merely witnessing factories. They were witnessing an idea in motion. It was the embodiment of freedom disciplined by purpose. Every conveyor, every rivet gun, spoke a language they didn't yet know, that liberty could be structured, that individual ambition could serve collective strength without compulsion. They understood, perhaps for the first time, how an open society wages total war, and why no regimented system could match it. The war's weapons have long since rusted, but the principle that powered them endures. It shaped not just peace, but the entire modern era, the jet age, the digital age, and the very foundations of global trade. Detroit's pulse became the heartbeat of a century defined by production. Its rhythm taught the world that victory doesn't always march. Sometimes, it assembles that a worker at Willow Run once wrote on the factory wall, "We build freedom here one bolt at a time." 8 decades later, that remains the quiet truth behind every democratic triumph. Power isn't simply the ability to destroy. It is the capacity to create faster than destruction can keep up. That was the revelation that stunned every German who ever stepped inside an American plant. They came expecting chaos and found coordination. They expected abundance without spirit and found both. In the end, they didn't just see how the Allies would win. They saw why. Because when an entire nation learns to turn work into willpower and liberty into logistics, defeat for tyranny is not a question of if, but when. If you like the video, hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real WW2 stories every day. Thanks for watching.